All right, good afternoon and welcome to the Fayetteville Public Library. Thank you for joining us here or if you're joining us on the live stream. Before you leave today, please be sure to fill out a program evaluation form available in the back of the room or on our website for those online. Your feedback helps us develop more programs like this one. Today, Dr. Jennifer Veilleux, a professor of psychological science at the University of Arkansas and licensed clinical psychologist, will be discussing her book, Open to Emotion: How Acknowledging, Understanding, and Regulating Your Feelings Can Improve Your Mental Health. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you for coming here today on a Sunday afternoon. So I'm here to talk about my book. And you might be asking, why a book? I ask myself that too. As a clinician, and one of the things I do in my job is I teach graduate students how to become therapists. And I was working with a graduate student one time, and I made a suggestion based on the science of emotion, and she said, wait, there's a science of emotion? And I said, actually, yes, there's a huge science of emotion. In fact, there might be too much science, and I don't think that's actually true. There's no such thing as too much science. But it is the case that there is so much science on emotion, and a lot of it is stuck behind paywalls, and it is very jargony, very statisticky, with lots of acronyms. And so it's very hard to get a sense of what that science is actually about. Combine that with the fact that many of the people that I work with, whether directly or the clients that I supervise through my graduate students, find emotions confusing at best and useless and horrible at worst. Those are words I've been directly said that this emotion, particularly sadness, is useless. And so I thought, when graduate students and clients have asked me for resources, like what is something I can read that will give me an indication of what emotions are about, that's sort of accessible and maybe prompts some self-reflection, I had nothing to give them. And so I thought, someone should write that book. And I thought, well, I guess maybe that should be me. I have the credentials to write that book, so I will write that book. And so the purpose of this book is an everyday resource for people to make emotions more understandable. So to try to help emotions be more of a friend and less of a useless, horrible monster. And so I think this book is useful for anyone who might struggle with their emotions, which I don't know about you, but that is me sometimes, who struggles with other people's emotions, which I do too as a parent, and then anybody who maybe if you don't struggle with emotions, but just want to understand emotions a little bit better. So that is the purpose of my book, and in this talk I'm going to give kind of a roadmap of if you were to read the book or buy the book, what you might kind of see in the journey through the book. So the first thing I want to go over is the metaphor of the book. And that is the metaphor that emotions are messages. So emotions are messages, and I say that because there's quite a bit of science that conveys what emotions are good for, why we have emotions in the first place. We have emotions because they're functional. They carry meaning. They tell us how we are responding to the world and to other people. They tell us what we care about. They help move people towards their goals. So you might have heard of the fight, flight, freeze reflex, right? So emotions can move people's bodies towards running away, if that's what they need to do, towards attacking, towards freezing, and towards all kinds of other things too that are not just that reflex. Emotions are also designed to be communicated. They facilitate communication. You could watch a movie with the sound off or in another language and have a sense of what's going on because emotions can tell us what's happening with another person. Emotions often communicate more effectively than words. So I think emotions are messages that are then important to receive. But emotions aren't always easy messages to receive. A lot of people struggle with their emotional messages in a variety of interesting ways. So let's remember here, I'm sticking with this metaphor that emotions are messages, and we're going to try to stick with emotions as snail mail for the most part, though email counts too. But I'm going to use the mailbox quite a bit. So there's a bunch of different ways in which people struggle with their emotions. One I call the watching the mailbox problem. Okay? This is when people pay too much attention to their feelings. You know, like I've had times where I have watched my UPS app, where's my package, when is it going to be here, right? And it takes up a lot of time and energy to sort of anticipate when those emotions are going to come. Another type of problem people encounter with emotional messages, this is an email one, is the spam cycle, right, of getting overwhelmed by messages, right? Or Harry Potter gets overwhelmed by mail coming from the ceiling. I have woke up one day and found 300 spam emails, and they kind of kept coming in, right? That can feel really exhausting to get too much mail. We can also read into our emotional messages too much. So some people assume that emotions are true, which they are to some extent, but emotions are feelings and reactions to the world. They are not necessarily the truth of the world. But if we overinterpret emotions as facts, that can cause problems for people. And sometimes, have you ever seen those movies where people get their hands stuck to plates or stuck to things, right? Some people's emotions, they get stuck to their emotions. So mail with sticky glue where it's difficult to detach from an emotion. People end up kind of sleeping with those emotional postcards under their pillow even if they don't want to. Some people also suffer from what I call the delivery unsuccessful program, so these are problems. So these are people who the emotions are coming in, but they're not paying enough attention to them. They're not actually arriving, and so there's a low awareness of emotions where people aren't attending to or tuning into their feelings. And then my personal favorite that I see a lot in the clients that I work with is people tossing away emotions, okay? This is the assuming that that feeling is useless or garbage or just plain awful, and so wanting to get rid of it as quickly as possible. So these are some of the problems that people can encounter with emotional messages. And so the purpose of the book is to try to provide some understanding from a scientific framework of different aspects of emotion to try to decrease the problems that people have with emotional messages and to increase the success and the function of emotion. So the metaphor is sort of the backdrop, and I'm going to go through these points here, these 9 points, generally go through the chapters of the book. So I'm going to give you little highlights of each chapter, recognizing that, of course, there's a lot more in the book than I can go over today in this short period of time. So first is emotional sensitivity. And this is the notion that people differ in their baseline emotional sensitivity, right? You know that maybe you are sensitive and the person you're sitting next to is not, or vice versa. And people vary in their emotional sensitivity on a spectrum. That's a normal curve there for those of you who are not used to seeing statistical symbols all the time. And we can see that on very low and very high sides of this emotional sensitivity spectrum, there tend to be some problems. People can vary in both reward sensitivity, which is the tendency to be sensitive to positive things and to rewarding information, and other people may be also or alternatively sensitive to threats. And what we see is people on the extremes. On our left here, we might see someone like Sherlock Holmes or Spock, who are very logical and very low in emotional sensitivity. And that can be good in that people like Sherlock Holmes are risk averse. They can go into risky situations. They're good in a crisis. The con, though, of people who are very, very low in sensitivity is it's difficult to connect, right? If you've seen the Sherlock show on TV, he is very hard to connect to, even to his friend Watson, right? It's hard to connect to people who you can't share things and be vulnerable with. Very high sensitivity has pros as well. People who are highly sensitive tend to be very passionate and empathic, great friends, people fun to be around. The cons are that people who are highly emotionally sensitive are vulnerable to psychopathology and symptoms like anxiety and depression, PTSD, all kinds of things like that. Both sides of the spectrum, the extreme sides, are associated with a lot of invalidation, Because if you look at that center, most people are in that sort of center lump. And that means that when sitting in the center and talking to someone at the extreme, people are often told on the low sensitive side, you're uncaring, you're mean, you're an ice queen, you're a cold fish. And people who are very high in sensitivity are told that they're too dramatic, that they have a thin skin, they're overreacting, all kinds of negative feedback lobbed especially at the high sensitive people. And all of these messages about the messages that people receive convey this idea that people with extreme sensitivity are not experiencing the world correctly, which is, of course, isn't true, right? It's just a spectrum, and it is on a maybe more extreme than the people in the middle, but there's nothing wrong inherently with being either low or high in sensitivity. But what can happen is when people get these messages over and over again from these comments from other people, they can start invalidating themselves and say, I'm not supposed to be sensitive, or I should experience more emotion. And so I think that it's not accurate to think there's a correct level of sensitivity, right? This is not Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where there is, a bed that's too soft and a bed that's too hard and a bed that's just right. There is no just right in emotional sensitivity. You are born with the temperament, the biology that you have, and the experiences that you walk around with. And so what I prefer is to think about sensitivity a little more like taste, right? We all vary in how many taste buds we have on our tongues, right? Some people can taste a lot of flavors, right? Like chefs or just people who are what are called super tasters. And so maybe people who are low in sensitivity just have fewer feeling buds, right? If we thought about emotions as emotion buds, like taste buds, and that people who are high in emotional sensitivity have more feeling buds, they get more emotional mail. That's not too much, it's just more, right? So we want to start thinking about how, no matter where you are on the spectrum, you might kind of have some compassion for yourself wherever you happen to be, and compassion for other people who might be at a different space on that dimension than you. So everyone has a baseline level of emotional sensitivity, and then people also vary in how aware they are of their emotion. So awareness is essentially asking the question, do you have emotional mail? So awareness means knowing if you're having an emotion, checking, am I feeling something right now? Am I getting an emotional message? But it might be useful to understand, to know if you're getting an emotion, to know how the mail gets in the mailbox in the first place. Where do emotions come from? So being aware of the stages of how emotions come about can help increase awareness for a couple of reasons, because you can be aware of the different stages of how emotions are generated, as well as being aware of the different elements that an emotion encompasses. Right? So the idea here is if you do know approximately like the route and timing of the mail carrier, you might know when to expect the mail, or at least might know to look. Like my house, the mail truck goes down one side of the street, we could see it go by. That means I'm likely to get my mail about 10 minutes later. So there's two components that we want to be aware of, and one is the elements of a feeling, emotion itself. Emotions are very hard to define. There's not a clear definition, but what we know is that emotions have multiple elements to them. They're states, they're transient, right? They come and they go, and they tend to have these 5 pieces. And I use these 5 because I like to use a hand as an easy way to remember them. There is a 6th, which is brain activity, but we can't easily measure or assess our own brain activity, so I'm going to ignore that, though obviously brain activity is happening. So there's 5 components of emotion. There's our felt emotion, right? That's the label that we might give, that subjective experience. Our physiological arousal, which is the index finger, because that's the one that's most easily used for assessing your heart rate. Emotions are embodied. They have internal physiological experiences. When people are anxious, their heart rate goes up. When people are angry, they get kind of internally tense. So emotions have this physiological piece. The thought processes are the middle finger because those are the ones that flick you off, right? They tell you things. Emotions have thoughts that go with them. Emotions also have action urges. Emotions tell us to do things, right? We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but different emotions are built with different kinds of functions and are moving us in different kinds of directions. And emotions are designed to be expressed. They come with facial expressions, body language. We're going to talk about that later as well. So one piece of awareness is being aware of emotions and of the components of emotion. People who tend to be less aware might know the physiological pieces but not have a subjective label. So the physiological arousal and the action urges tend to be easier to access, and then the changes in thinking, the felt emotion, and the expression tend to be a little bit trickier. So awareness of components of the state is one piece, and awareness about how emotions come about is another. So a lot of people think that this is how emotions work. You experience something, like something we've all experienced, like you get cut off in traffic, and that makes you angry, or at least me. I don't know about anybody else. That makes me angry, right? But that's actually not how emotions work. Triggers do not directly cause emotional responses. And that should make sense to you if you've, say, ever gone to a horror movie, right? Not everybody's scared at a horror movie, right? Some people laugh hysterically, right? Some people have no reaction at all, and they're watching the same stimulus. So the stimulus itself is not what causes the emotion. It's the pieces in between. So how emotions come about actually works like this. There's some kind of trigger. That could be something like watching a horror movie or getting cut off in traffic. It could also be a memory, something internal, or an anticipation of something that we're thinking about, a test or Thanksgiving and who's going to be there. And then we have a cycle. So the first thing is we pay attention to some aspect of that trigger, of that situation. And then we appraise or we interpret what we paid attention to. And then the emotional response comes from that, right? That's why two people at a horror movie are going to have different responses. Someone might pay attention to like how overly dramatic it is and then think like, girl, don't go down that hallway. This is like so fake, and be amused. And other people could be thinking, well, if I'm in that situation, like I'm walking down the hall, I'm really scared, attending to the sort of fear in the music, and then appraise that as dangerous and then have a jump scare, right? So when it comes to being aware, we want to be attentive and aware of our emotions to know if we're having a feeling at all. Right? Are we feeling anything right now? The science suggests that awareness is a good thing. Right? Being more aware of emotions is associated with more empathy, being less impulsive in reaction to our emotions, whereas low awareness tends to be associated with more psychological problems. So this is an area in the world of awareness where there might be a decent Goldilocks middle ground, right? Because paying too much attention to our emotion, we get into some of these sticky male problems or the over-interpreting problems. Being too low, we end up with delivery unsuccessful problems. So some of this is trying to figure out and do some self-assessment of if you are aware of emotions or if you're paying too much attention to emotion, and using some strategies like mindfulness, which can help people reduce over-attention to emotion, make emotions less sticky. But for people who are low, mindfulness can also help tune people into their internal experiences and might help increase awareness into that kind of optimal zone in the middle. Chapter 3 feels like a little bit of a deviation for an emotion book, but it's one of my favorites because I like to think about, when we think about getting an emotional message, I often ask, okay, if we're getting a message, we're getting a piece of mail, who is sending that message, right? Where's it coming from? And so my answer to that is values. Why? Well, one of the things the science is pretty clear about is that you cannot have an emotion about something that doesn't matter. If a feeling is present, that means something matters. What is it? It's not always what's happening in that situation. It could be something that situation sparks or reminds you of or is covering up for something else. But the idea is trying to understand what matters, meaning values can be a really useful insight into emotions. So values are, the way I think of values, are chosen life directions. So these are not roles that you have. So people might value, when I ask people this question, what do you value? People will say family or friends. Like, yes, but in this particular instance, I'm talking about the attributes underneath. People can value family for all different kinds of reasons. So in my book, I have a values clarification activity where I have people list 42 values, and you can kind of pick which ones are your top values. And then I will show you in the book a pie chart like this that is based in the Schwartz values system, where values are generally grouped into these 4 categories. There are values related to self-transcendence, which are values about doing things for others outside of the self. And then the opposite side of the circle for that are values related to self-enhancement, people kind of wanting to move themselves forward. The other axis, values of openness to change, are values around kind of trying to do things differently, growing, being like different than you are now. And conservation is about trying to keep things and people close by and safe. And so what the science of values has shown over several decades is that when people live life according to their values, they tend to feel better. They tend to feel more nourished. They tend to have more positive emotions, and that should make sense, right? So living life according to values is good. We also find that when people's values are neglected or languished, that people tend to feel bad about themselves because they're not living life according to their values. When people are depressed, for example, and they kind of withdraw from things in their life that they've cared about, they feel ashamed of themselves and just disconnected, often from their values. Values can also be underneath anxiety and anger, those more kind of activated feelings, because those occur when values are challenged, right? When someone blocks you from experiencing one of your values, you're likely to feel angry. When situations or you're worried that you won't be able to feel something that you value, particularly values in the sort of safety, security, that conservation realm, people tend to feel anxious. People can also have an imbalance in their feelings or feel conflict between their own values, right? And that those conflicts can create emotional experiences as well. So the book goes through these sort of activities and helps you map your values onto your emotional experiences. That is easier when you know how to label emotions well. So when I do talks like this about emotions, or I generally land on the fact that labeling, if people ask me, if you had to learn one emotion regulation strategy, if you could give me the one thing that works the best, what is it? This is what I say, which is wild because labeling doesn't sound like a regulation strategy, right? You're having an emotion, you're just putting a name on it. That's not doing anything with the emotion, except it is. So the idea of labeling is that labeling is sort of classifying the mail. We have different kinds of mail, right? We got bills, we have advertisements, we have letters and cards from friends and family, we have notices, we have, election, coupons, that's not a word, for elections, but advertisements, right? And so emotions are kind of the same way. They come in different varieties, and knowing what you're feeling can be a guidepost to what you care about, what your values are, and what to do next. So emotional labeling is the process of putting a name to a feeling and a specific name. So unspecific, I feel crummy, I feel upset. I asked my 11-year-old this morning what he felt, and he just screamed very loudly, which was not a word, and it was very shrill. But he could have said, I am angry, which he eventually did with much prompting from me. So being specific, I'm feeling sad, homesick, a little nauseated. These are all words that you could use that are more specific. So the idea is to build an emotional vocabulary and attach a word or words to your emotional experience. Well, why? Why should you do that? Well, I said that labeling is a superpower in emotion regulation, and it is a unpredictable, or it's a strategy that most people don't think of as a strategy. In fact, most people think if you put a name to your emotion, that will actually make it worse. It will like manifest it if you put a name on it. That is not true. There's some fascinating science that when people put a word to their emotion, their body and brain starts regulating under the surface, right? So I like the phrase, I didn't come up with this, but name it to tame it is an excellent solution. When you put a label onto the emotion, it starts all kinds of chemical changes in your brain and body. And it helps you decide what your emotion is. We know if you say you're upset or you feel bad, that's negative, right? You're not feeling good. But it doesn't actually tell you anything about what the message of the emotion is other than it's unpleasant, unfun. But the specific emotions are designed to move us in specific kinds of directions. So knowing what you're feeling can give you a better indication of if your emotion is trying to help you or it's trying to get in your way. The labels also highlight values, okay? Because the label is the message of the emotion, and that is sent from a particular value. So in the book, I go through this in more detail, but essentially, different emotions have different messages. So surprise, you feel surprised, that's the message that something new is happening, right? Anger is about injustice or unfairness. Fear is about a threat that's happening right now, and anxiety is about a future threat, right? Sadness is about a loss or a lack of something important. And so you'll notice that a lot of these have the word something or someone, and that's because it can't be specifically tied to you without you filling in some of those blanks, and that something new and unexpected is happening, right? That's likely attached to a value, right? Someone I care about has been wronged. Well, that often goes along with values related to disrespect or loyalty or things like that. So labeling is really important. It is also very hard, right? A lot of feelings are not just one word, and that's okay. You can use more than one word. I would say try to stick with like 3 or 4. I've worked with clients who've tried to use about 15 different words to describe their emotion, and you end up losing some of the power when you get too granular. And to label, you can learn emotion vocabularies, practice in retrospect, thinking about emotions that you've already had, labeling what emotions people seem to be experiencing in shows. There's all different kinds of ways to practice labeling. Okay, so an intermediate summary of where we've come so far, halfway through the book, is that emotions are messages. Some people get more mail than others. To be able to label, first you have to know that a message is there at all, right? So awareness is the first step, and awareness can be trained. The messages are sent from values because emotions only occur when something matters. And then the content of the message can be learned by labeling the feeling and using kind of the emotion families to understand what the sort of crux of the message is, all right? So I want to move a little closer towards emotion regulation now. This book is intended to kind of give people insights about how emotion and emotional processes work, and then what to do about them, right? And so before we talk about navigating emotions that arise, I want to talk a little bit about decreasing vulnerability to experiencing emotions you don't want in the first place. And I have been using this emotions as messages metaphor the whole time, and I'm going to step away from that a little bit because it doesn't map onto this chapter super well. Instead, I want to think about chefs and football players. So chefs and football players all wear protective gear, right? If you don't wear a coat or a hat, your hair could catch on fire if you're in the kitchen. If you don't wear non-slip shoes, there's like food all over a kitchen, you might fall. This goes for professional chefs for sure. If you watch The Bear, you see like they wear stuff, right? And then football players as well. If you aren't wearing a helmet, you know, they get concussions anyway, but would be way worse without a helmet or without all that padding. So why do chefs and football players wear all this protective gear? It's not because to stop them from getting hurt. It's because they know that there's some element of danger in what they do, and they want to reduce that danger through padding, through kind of this prophylactic method. If you have your hair in a hairnet and your hair doesn't catch on fire, you kind of won't even necessarily know that that prevented it, but it did. So the idea is, what could we do to kind of create some emotional padding? Because you can't escape unpleasant feelings. Even living by yourself in the woods, that could get lonely, right? You might disconnect from your values in that way. We all have unpleasant emotions. But there are things that we can do to prevent those feelings from having quite as bad of a sting. So we haven't talked much about emotion regulation, and I will get there. But the skills that we've talked about so far, mindful awareness, values, labeling, these are actually all parts of emotional conditioning, which are kind of like what chefs have to do to like practice chopping their carrots so that they can do it quickly, or football players doing drills, doing runs, kind of getting their bodies ready so that in a game they can respond quickly and instinctively without having to think about it, right? So these skills help you do that with emotion. They also can help increase understanding, right? So chefs have to learn flavor profiles, and football players have to learn different plays. So the things that we've talked about so far do fit into emotion regulation because they help condition your body. There are also ways to reduce emotional vulnerability by adding activities to your life that build padding. And the reason to do this is that because of this way that emotions are generated, right? It's not the trigger that itself leads to the emotion, it's the attention that we put onto it and the way that we interpret it. Well, when we have lower resources, we're more likely to attend to the negative, right? Appraise a situation in an extreme way and end up really with a strong emotional response that feels loud and overwhelming. So the idea is to kind of plan ahead. And there's actually some really cool research in self-control that shows that people with better self-control are not actually better at like dealing with temptations. They are better at not putting themselves in tempting situations in the first place. And so that's kind of what this coping ahead idea is about. So that doesn't mean, again, avoiding situations that could be negative. It means doing things to kind of buffer and give yourself resources so that you can handle those negative situations more gracefully. So the three that I cover in my book are increasing pleasure. So that means that doing things that are fun and enjoyable, that you can sort of savor. There's a thing called the negativity bias, which is this idea that we pay way more attention to negative stuff than positive, right? If you get 5 comments, right, about your haircut, you're going to remember the one that was like, nice haircut, as opposed to the one that, like, the people that feel really kind. So we tend to pay attention to negative stuff because it's more threatening, and that can make a real imbalance. So you can do things to try to correct that imbalance. So from a emotions as messages standpoint, this could be making sure you're getting more emotional mail. Sign up for listservs that bring you joy. You know, you like cute cats? I bet you there's someone who'll send you a picture of a cute cat every day. So you can make that happen for yourself. The second is attending to physical health. So our emotions happen in our bodies. When our bodies are not in good shape, we are far more likely to have strong emotional reactions. So eating nourishing food, trying to get enough sleep, drinking water, taking medications as prescribed, limiting substance use, getting exercise, all of these things help condition the body so that emotions aren't as overwhelming. So similar, like you make sure you have enough energy to walk to the mailbox to be able to deal with your mounds of mail. And then finally, we want to help people, coping ahead practices connecting to find moments of meaning. And this just doesn't mean just spending time with people, right? You could spend time with someone and that could be unpleasant, right? Not everybody is supportive. And it also can feel overwhelming sometimes, right? And so connecting to find moments of meaning could be having a nice conversation with a barista. It could be spending time with friends or family in a way that feels meaningful to you. And so whatever that is that feels meaningful, that could be like a long phone conversation with somebody you haven't seen in a while. It could be, a 10-minute board game with a niece or nephew. It doesn't matter as long as these small moments build up that are meaningful and that are quality for you, not for anybody else. And so the idea is that when you're connected to others and feel embedded, in values, that dealing with these messages, particularly unpleasant ones, seems less daunting. Okay, so we now kind of recognize that there are all these ways we can condition our bodies and our brains, and that we can plan ahead, recognizing that emotions are going to happen. And so when they do, how do we get the message of the emotion in a way that allows us to move towards our goals? So I think about opening the envelope as the process of looking curiously at the emotion that you're experiencing and then deciding what to do with it. It's not, I got a message, I have to carry it around with me. It's not, I got a message, I got to get rid of this because it's awful, but you might want to get rid of it, but you need to look at it first, right? The idea is we shouldn't be recycling or throwing away our messages without actually seeing what they have to say. So even when we engage in coping ahead practices, unpleasant emotions pop up, right? And so what opening the envelope means is slowing down, acknowledging and getting the message of the emotion before we decide what to do with it. The idea is that not all emotions need to be changed or regulated. Some can be used to kind of harness and move you towards your goals. And so what we're doing here is moving towards an understanding of the science of emotion regulation. And emotion regulation kind of has another cycle to it. We have a lot of cycles here in affective and emotion science. But the idea is an emotion is experienced, right? We have a trigger, we attend to it, we evaluate it, and we have an emotional response. And then we have to decide, okay, I'm feeling something. Is this how I want to feel? If yes, great, use that feeling. If not, maybe you want to regulate or change it or do something about it. If you decide you want to regulate, then you have to select how. How am I going to do something about this emotion? Once you select a general strategy, then you have to implement it in a specific way, right? So if you think, and we'll talk about some strategies shortly, but if you think, all right, I might want to distract myself, well, you could do that by taking a nap, by calling a friend, by watching a show, by going on a walk. You could do any number of particular ways to implement that strategy. And then you have to monitor to see, is that strategy actually working? Is your emotion moving towards what you want to feel like? Is that feeling that you don't like moving down, or feelings you do like moving up? And so you have to monitor to see if that's happening. So we're going to focus a little bit here and open the envelope because on identify, this is a complicated process. I've simplified it. Well, I didn't come up with this model. But the identification stage of should I regulate at all is really important for this open the envelope idea. And it relates to the goals that you have for yourself and how you want to feel. So in a given moment, and I do recognize that emotions tend to happen fast and you don't always have time to go through all these steps, but sometimes maybe you do, and then you can practice them and they come faster, often very automatically. So recognizing what do you want to feel right now, okay? What is the desired emotion? We've already labeled, so we already know what we're feeling. And then what do you want to feel? Now, these are the questions that I think these second and third questions that are not necessarily questions that people always ask. So, what emotion would be useful? That is different than what emotion you want because it would be fun. Some emotions can be useful in ways that are different than their level of pleasantness. So there's a variety of research, for example, that shows that anger, while not fun to experience, can help people, say, confront their boss about an injustice. Somebody else got a raise instead of you. A little bit of anger can be useful there, right? Anxiety. Well, anxiety has some usefulness too, right? If you weren't anxious about getting a sunburn, maybe you wouldn't wear sunscreen. So a lot of these emotions have a purpose, and you have to think about whether that emotion would be helpful for you right now. And then this question is one that a lot of people don't think about. My lab at the University of Arkansas has been doing some research on these sort of long-term emotional goals that people have for themselves. And you want to think about goals for how would experiencing this emotion now help you in the long run. So when we ask people to talk about some of their long-term emotional goals, people talk about goals for regulation, that they want to feel more good and less bad, that they want to not be as impulsive, that they want to be better at regulating, better at connecting to people. These three are the goals that people have the least, and yet they're the most related to well-being. So goals to express and share their feelings with others, goals to understand, and goals to allow emotion. These are related to better mental health. So feeling something unpleasant now in the short term can help you feel less unpleasant later in the long term. And then if you decide, all right, this emotion is not particularly helpful to me right now, maybe you regulate. But if how you're feeling right now, even if it's not desired, could help you, maybe don't regulate and use that emotion instead. So the idea is thinking about emotional goals both in the current moment and in the long run to help you decide whether or not to kind of harness and use that emotion or just kind of let that emotion play out, or if you should try to regulate. And if you want to regulate, there's a ton of options for regulation strategies that are available, and many of them are well studied by emotion scientists. So the reason that I showed you, in part, this stages of emotion generation is all of the strategies, or most of the strategies that we have studied in emotion science map on to those different stages of generation. So one thing you can do to regulate emotion is to change the trigger, alter the situation itself. That's a problem-solving approach, right? You could do that. Distraction is an attention-shifting strategy, right? If you're attending to the negative pieces, trying to move your attention to somewhere else. Reappraisal is probably the most studied emotion regulation strategy, and reappraisal is trying to think about the situation in a different way. A lot of times people say it just means, they think it means kind of thinking about the situation, a negative situation, positively. And reappraisal is not just thinking about it positively, but trying to think about maybe what the other person was thinking, or trying to get some context to the situation, trying to look at the situation from a different perspective, because that can often change the way that you feel. And then there are ways to change the emotional response directly, such as through deep breathing or through grounding activities that help you connect to the current moment, connect to your body and the environment, because emotions tend to get perpetuated by our minds. And so these anchoring in the moment strategies can help reduce that activated emotional response. Now, there's way more strategies than these. I'm just giving a couple of examples, or one example for each of the stages, but I go through a lot more of these in the book. And the idea is that you want to build a regulation toolbox, right? You want to have strategies and tactics in each family, right? Each one of these sort of ways of navigating or regulating emotions, to have a lot of options, so that in a given moment of time, you've had a lot of things that you could practice and pull from. And so the idea is that if an emotional message isn't serving you, you can change it with all of these strategies. Now, although emotional expression is a part of emotion, I save this for last because emotional expression is very complicated, and I don't mean the science is complicated, though that is too. I mean, expression is complicated for human beings. And so we think about emotional messages as we're getting a mail, like getting a message to us. But emotions are also designed to be broadcast, which means you're getting a message, but it's also kind of going outward. You're inadvertently broadcasting that message to somebody else. And they're supposed to do that. Emotions are supposed to be broadcast so that other people know what's going on with you, right? It's because emotions are designed to help us connect to people. And there's two kind of pathways that we can express emotion. One is we can express emotions without sharing with another person. And the second is expressing emotions to other people. Now, expressing without sharing could be, say, like Elsa on a mountaintop. If you're unfamiliar with Frozen, that's Elsa. Like crying or expressing alone, letting the emotion out. Or through a more targeted activity like expressive writing. Again, the idea is that emotions inside the body are meant to be broadcast and leave the body, so finding a way to do that. There are some really great expressive writing techniques that can help people process their feelings. And then sharing with emotions with other people, this is where things get really tricky. A researcher a couple of decades ago coined the term the paradox of distress expression. And that's because emotions are meant to be shared, and sharing emotions helps enormously. When people share their feelings, that can help people kind of cope. They get support. They can process their feelings by talking to somebody else. Many, many people, when they feel things, they want to share those things. They want to share with another person. But other people can be jerks, right? Other people can be really invalidating. And so we learn, even kids get messages like, don't cry, stop showing your feelings. And so people start learning pretty early that they should try to shut their feelings down because other people don't want to experience them. So many, many people try to mask or hide their feelings, which is called expressive suppression. So emotions are good, but emotions are also not good because other people are not kind about them. And so there's multiple ways in which people can broadcast their feelings. So people could broadcast their feelings directly, like saying, I'm feeling down, I'm feeling sad. People also tend to express their emotions non-verbally, right? So this is where we can see someone's feelings when we watch a video, or we can even see people on the bus. I like to guess what people are feeling on the bus. It's a fun game that I play. Based on their body language, facial expressions, or tone of voice, even if I'm not listening to their words. And what can be very confusing is that sometimes someone can say, you can say, how are you? And they'll be like, fine. Well, they're not fine, obviously. But do you pay attention to the words because they say they're fine, or do you pay attention to the nonverbals? And so attending to emotion in other people can be very confusing when there's a mismatch between these two types of channels on the broadcast, the verbal channel and the nonverbal channel. So emotional expression, while really valuable, can create a lot of disruptions and a lot of conflict, right? I say this as someone who does a fair amount of couples therapy. And we talk about these kinds of things a lot in the couples that I work with. So trying to teach people to ask for what they want. So when sharing emotions, saying, don't need a response from you, I'm trying to work things out, or asking for help, or just asking for validation, right? Sometimes you might share something with someone else, and the other person tries to fix it, where you don't want to be fixed, you just want to be heard. So you might want normalization, you might want some other person to engage in distraction, right? Other people can help us with all of those toolbox strategies. And other people can help with perspective taking. That's a reappraisal tactic that other people can engage in. So other people can help us with all of those pieces. So expression is really valuable, and it is hard to do well. All of this comes together when thinking about how to be flexible with emotion regulation. This is sort of the last chapter in the book, and is one of the most important things I think that I want for people when they navigate their emotions. Emotion regulation flexibility is about literally being flexible, right? And that means being able to bend accordingly, to have the strategy that you use to deal with your emotion match the situation. And so emotion regulation flexibility has started to be really popular in the science in the last about decade. And there are kind of three main components of flexibility, and one is having a big toolbox. If you only have one way to regulate your emotions or navigate your emotions, you only have one tool to choose from. But like, a hammer isn't good for everything. A hammer is good for putting a nail in the wall. It's really bad if you have a clogged toilet, right? You will literally break your toilet, right? You need tools that are for the job at hand. And then you have to be sensitive to the context. You have to know what kind of situation needs the hammer or the screwdriver, what kind of situation might be best used for a glue gun. And to do that involves some of the things we talk about earlier in the book of learning your emotions, learning your reactions, learning what you want, paying attention to what is going on in those situations so that you can be sensitive and adapt accordingly. And the other is monitoring, right? If you always use the same strategy and you're not paying attention to the fact that it only works sometimes, you're going to keep doing it, right? If you're trying a strategy 18 times and it doesn't work, well, you should update and try something else. And so reflecting and giving yourself feedback, monitoring is really crucial. The other main component of flexibility is balance, right? Which is not technically a part of flexibility, right? I am very inflexible. I just tried to sit and reach at a museum last week. My 8-year-old smoked me. But I'm pretty good at balance, right? And so they go together. And so balance here means sometimes allowing and accepting your emotions, letting them be. Unlike other problems that don't go away unless you do something about them, emotions do. They rise and they fall. They do not stay forever. We don't have to change all of them, but sometimes we do. Sometimes it would be better if we regulated. And so using the strategies in this book to sometimes allow and understand and see what the emotion's trying to tell us, and then sometimes trying to change it, that is a part of being flexible. So, all this to say, emotions are messages. They're meaningful. They can help you. They can help you connect to other people and help you with your goals for yourself, for your life. They're important to receive. So, open them, right? Some people get more. That's okay. Pay attention. Be aware that a message is here. Listen to the values. Figure out what kind of message it is. Cope ahead. Help the mailman help you. Open the message. Think about your goals and what you want and if the feeling can help you. Sometimes get rid of it, sometimes broadcast it, and balance. All right? Thank you. I got like 8 minutes, I think. We got time for some questions if anyone wants them. You can order the book here from the publisher. It's also on Amazon. I know the library has a couple copies. I think one of them's checked out, but one of them's back there. Possibly. They are skulking around. He would not be happy if I said what he was mad about. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yes, you might be sick of this one, but I feel like maybe it might help establish a foundation. I just noticed on your slide, brought up the question, can you specify the difference between psychosis and psychopathy?
Psychopathology?
Yes.
Yeah. So psychosis is associated with schizophrenia. Psychosis has to do with people having hallucinations and delusions. It's a very specific form of psychopathology. Psychopathology just means any kind of mental disorder. So depression, anxiety, personality disorders, OCD, like all of that stuff. Yeah.
So I guess, like when you had over there some more sensitive to emotion, psychopath, does that include people who have, let's say, schizophrenia, hallucinations, delusions, then oftentimes they're responding, overreacting to emotion? Is that kind of what's happening?
That's a great question that I actually don't know enough about to answer, to say with definition. I know that people with schizophrenia, for example, tend to have affective blunting, which basically means they tend to not show a lot of emotion, tend to be kind of flat on the outside, but have experiences on the inside. So whether hallucinations and delusions are a response to heightened emotion that doesn't know where to go, that's a great question. I don't know. That's not a literature I'm super familiar with, but it's a really interesting question. I wish I had a better answer, but I don't. I'm not going to make up something that I don't know the answer to.
And you're dealing with it different if it's schizoaffective and schizophrenia is bipolar.
Yep. Yeah. Katie?
So, I'm curious because I think that a lot of people who've not been in therapy or who haven't done any reading on this might think that they're engaging emotion regulation strategies when they're doing something that I would say is maladaptive, right? So, a number of people who like go home at the end of a stressful work day and have a beer or wine or several, right? And they might think that that's helping them regulate their emotions, or they stop at the bar on the way home so they don't yell at their kids or spouse or whatever. What would you say is a way where you could explain to people what would be considered healthy versus unhealthy? Or is it about like scope, sort of degree of use versus abuse?
It's about scope and degree and context sensitivity. So it used to be that people thought about there were maladaptive strategies and adaptive strategies, and that language has kind of gone out the window with emotion science because, typically the things that were considered maladaptive were rumination, repetitive negative thinking, rumination and worry, and avoidance. And so substance use is often thought of from the avoidance category, right? I'm going to sort of numb my feelings. I don't want to pay attention to these right now. And like a little bit avoidance or distraction. I like to think of sometimes getting your head, alcohol, for example, helps people not think about consequences and just kind of pay attention to what's right in front of them. Well, that could actually help someone detach if they're tending to ruminate for a short period of time. The problem is when people get overly reliant on any strategy or they think that they need to have a drink to be able to calm down, that's when things start to get problematic. And so I would never say there's any strategy that's flat out like bad, but trying to think about what are the consequences over time as somebody uses that and to making sure that they have a big toolbox so that they're not becoming overly reliant and not trying to push away those emotions all the time and making sure that some of what they could be doing is processing, right? If you have a drink to kind of calm down from an angry work day and then the next day come back to it and are like, all right, I'm going to think this through, fine, right? It can be fine, but it might not be.
Continue to think about that. It's over, it's done with, I've forgiven and let things go.
Yeah, so I mean, there's all different kinds of strategies for stuff like that we, talk about in therapy. So like one that I really like is a dialectical behavior therapy strategy called broken record, which is like you come up with a line and you just keep repeating it like, we're not going to talk about that. You want to talk about that? I'm going to leave the room. And like, you just keep repeating it until she gets the message. And so it's like a broken record. You keep saying the same thing until it's sort of a way of assertively communicating that has a consequence to it.
So that applies in like you were talking about in the youth term process and you're communicating with somebody else. Like in that one scene.
Right.
When to zip it.
Right, because it's probable that like your sister's trying to like work through some of her own stuff, but it might be like a trigger for you that you do not want to engage in, and so you don't have to engage in that. There's the like I love you, but this is not the conversation for me right now, right? And this stuff's tricky, right? That's why people have therapists. That's why there's tons and tons of strategies out there, right? This is an overview about how emotional processes work, but obviously every individual situation is really unique. And so, I hope that a book like this can help people increase their understanding. And sometimes, it can be useful to sort of get ideas for how this can work, in your life with a therapist. It is 3:00. I do not want to keep you, but thank you so much for coming today and listening to this talk.